Hey everyone, we're here for our next talk. We have Sid, the CTO of Roll. He'll be doing a talk on money Legos for communities, social money, NFTs, and Web2 bridges. And can you guys just confirm you can hear him? And I'll let him take it from here. You can
Thanks,
start
Chief, for
talking.
that intro. Hi. Yeah, thanks. So we're going to just dive into this one. Just want to try to keep this under 20 minutes or so. I would love to have some questions from the viewers as well. We have quick intro. I'm Sid Kalla. I'm the co-founder and CTO of Roll. And today we'll talk about money Legos for communities. There's a lot of talk about interoperability in Ethereum and how protocols can build on top of one another. So you have a stable coin issued by Maker, called DAI, put it in Compound, wrap it, get CDAI, put it in another, go liquidity mine with that, get a governance token, and so on, and you can kind of build like an infinite chain of protocols off of that, of those base level protocols. But while DeFi is super exciting, there is a value layer that comes below that, and that's kind of almost the value layer, really. So DeFi today on Ethereum is mostly built on Ether as the native token of Ethereum, and stablecoins, which are usually USD tracked tokens. But the world we're entering is there are going to be multiple tokens that you can build a lot of these Legos for. And that's kind of high level what we're here to talk about today. This market is relatively smaller than some of the other markets that you maybe have looked at, but that also makes them pretty interesting and fascinating. So yeah, that's kind of a quick intro on that. But before we really dive in, there's this broad idea of the value being owned by communities as opposed to platforms. And this has kind of been in the public consciousness for a while, but kind of coming more and more every day with social media. To kind of realize this whole vision of, let's own our own data, let communities own the value, there are actually two very distinct layers to that. So one is what I call the value stack, and one is the data stack. The value stack is simply how the value relationships are encoded and exchanged. So these could be like Ethereum tokens, that's your ERC20s as fungible tokens, 721 non-fungible tokens, 1155, kind of like a hybrid. You can plug these into DeFi, other protocols, all of that good stuff. The very important thing for this is like censorship resistance, in the sense that no single party can block trades. It's not as decentralized as some of the other tokens, in the sense that the value is still coming from a community that could live on Web2. In the case of NFTs, it could come from a game, for example, that's more or less centrally controlled by one game developer. But the thing is, like, as long as the token is on Ethereum, like that game developer cannot block you from trading or using some other app inside the ecosystem. So that's kind of where the power comes from. And there's also the data stack, which is, which encodes, let's say, your social graph, the relationships with your friends, your messages, and all that. My opinion, we're still like 3 to 5 years away from that being really decentralized. We're obviously, Filecoin being a good example of what that world might look like. But what we'll be focusing completely today on this talk is just the value stack. So that's going to be your Ethereum tokens, really. And another quick note, this is crypto. What I'll be focusing on the talk is completely about like the non-speculative values. For high level social money, that's kind of how it becomes a medium of exchange inside a community, and also a store of value. For NFTs, it can be anything from collectibles to proof of an event, like a proof of attendance, for example, or proof that you accomplished something of value for the community, like proof of X badges, for example. There's always speculative value with crypto. There's a speculative way. That's not the purpose of this talk. Just to give a high level of where the state of the world is today, that's a typo with in Masari's source, by the way, so it should be 150 million. So that's about where we are at the moment. So you can see kind of a sweet spot, less than some of the billion-dollar protocols, but somewhat higher than some of the smaller tokens that you might see. Now, we'll come back to this just to understand the state of where we are in terms of a broader financial primitives and what are feasible today to build and what are not yet, because the value encapsulated by social money is not as large as some of the other protocols. So when we are thinking about how to really think about communities, community value, their ownership, social money, the state of the world is changing a lot every day. But at a high level, I like to think of these as primitives, right? So it's like you have a layer 1, you have layer 2, you probably have layer 3, so almost like a networking stack that you see in traditional internet, for example. So the layer one that kind of I like to compare it to TCP/IP. That's kind of your base layer of addressing networks, kind of a very basic standardization of what means what. So for me, I'm going to talk into like each of those and kind of talk through those. Layer two is kind of like an application layer. This is like you can use some of the primitives of layer one and kind of build very interesting things. The one interesting thing about social money is it kind of combines the Web 2 and Web 3 worlds pretty seamlessly. So some of the protocols that you'll see in layer two as kind of like an application layer are going to be Web 2 primitives. The Curation and Access specifically, which I'll kind of touch upon and show you where we are right now. And things like exchange, for example, are very Web 3, like Web 3 primitives. So like, let's throw something into a Uniswap, or in the case of NFTs, let's throw them into a marketplace like OpenSea, for example. So just diving in, so I'm just going to go through very high level layer one. So think of layer one as the basic building blocks that you need in order to make any social money or any community currency or community money like really successful. Though the first step, not very surprisingly, should be the creation and minting. But there are some nuances to that, which I would like to touch upon here. There are technical parameters that you'll need to set at issuance. The very basics of here are token standards. So that's your fungible tokens like ERC20 tokens. And then you have non-fungible tokens like ERC721s. These are decisions that you cannot easily change down the road. This also affects what kind of interoperability you can expect from what you're building. So kind of important decisions to be made at the side. Blockchains, always the case. We'll talk about Ethereum here, but no harm trying out another blockchain. Also kind of some trade-offs with L2, somewhat similar in that sense that you save massively on fees. So you can build something much more scalable, but at the same time, you lose a bit of interoperability. You also lose a bit of ease of use. It's already hard enough for regular people to understand Web3. And now if you explain kind of an L2 and how to go from L1 to L2, that becomes more complicated. So the UX becomes clunkier. The tooling is not there yet. So just some realistic real world trade-offs there. In addition to the technical stuff, you also want to think about the economic parameters when you're doing. So basic things like supply curves. We have seen all kinds of models. So we've seen inflation, deflation, and kind of having like a constant supply. Social money that's issued on Roll, for example, has a constant supply. So that's easy to understand for regular users. We've seen inflationary models in some places like, so NFT art is a good example. If you're an artist, you don't want to massively inflate your art because that devalues your art, your community, the holders, your early collectors. So if you're trying to mint like 100 tokens of every single art piece that you create every couple of days, that's probably not a good idea. In terms of deflation, economically speaking, if you have any cash flows or earnings, kind of the act of giving out dividends versus, let's say, doing the buyback and burn are exactly the same. We've seen some people play around with deflationary models where you can use part of the real economic returns that your community might generate, and then use that to buy back your tokens in the open market and burn them as a way of giving value back to that community. We make some decisions on vesting, but that's another thing you want to think about. Especially on the Web 2 side, you want to make sure that the incentives are aligned for the community and let's say the creator or the originator of the community themselves. So just some, again, like I said, high-level technical and economic parameters to think about before you start building these. So once you've issued something, once you've created something, the other thing is circulation. I'm kind of going to cover that in earn and spend. You can also think of that as like sending. At a technical level, that's simply the movement of value on Ethereum or L2 or another blockchain that you might have used. But the most important thing on earning and spending is the social questions around that. The question is like, who earns what? So how much do you earn and when? But more importantly, it's that who decides who earns what and when. We have seen two models here work really, and kind of you can think of that as a spectrum or a scale. On the one end, you have a more decentralized DAO-like governance system that's kind of becoming more popular with some of the Ethereum projects, and people are experimenting, but there's no magic bullet for that. There's issues with voter apathy, for example. And then there's the other extreme, which we have seen very successfully actually being used by many Web2 communities, especially those that are centered around a creator. So if you're part of a creators community, the creator kind of becomes the natural central point, and all of the community members kind of trust that creator to make decisions that are right for their community. That trust may be misplaced, that trust may be not be misplaced, but it makes it much more efficient when it comes to governance for deciding who wants to do what. So when you're iterating, it's a good, like the dictatorship model as opposed to democracy is a good thing to iterate and build the community out and then slowly decentralize that ability. Some Web2 considerations as well. Ideally, you want to be able to earn and spend on existing platforms that already exist. So these are your Discords, Telegrams, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, all of the good stuff that you all know about. This is a hard problem to solve. There's no good like Web2 to Web3 bridges, and there's never going to be a perfect solution that's going to make everyone happy. So it's all about trade-offs. The other primitive, the last one that I would like to touch upon is the idea of staking. At a technical level, it's simply proof of holding or a time lockup. So you just lock something up in a smart contract, it's going to release it after a period of 6 months or n number of blocks where the block are approximately 15 seconds on Ethereum, 12 seconds. On a social side, providing a long-term stake in the community is what you are generally looking for. So these are people, like a super simple practical example would be, hey, you have a moderator on Discord is providing a ton of value. You probably want to pay them in logged tokens. That's kind of what we have seen. But that's a very small limiting case. Like the use cases are much broader. But what you can also do is you can reward and provide incentives for people who are locking up that tokens, kind of having that long-term stake in the community. The other thing that we have seen very interestingly is kind of the idea of social status that can be used with the concept of staking. It's a bit of an underexplored design space, but we've seen a lot of interest and early adoption for this. So someone who locks up, think of very similar like a quadratic voting kind of thing, right? If you have 100 tokens and you lock it up for a year, you get the same status as someone who has 10,000 tokens, but let's say locks it up only for a couple of days. So things like that. The Web2 considerations here are simply, well, the ability to stake easily, the ability to show proof that you have staked, and then the ability to verify proof of stake on natively on a Web2 platform. So kind of talking about all that, so we've kind of gone through the layer one. These are the basic building blocks, kind of without which the non-speculative value wouldn't exist. And after that, you kind of want to see the value stacks here already today. So this is a snapshot from CoinGecko. They kind of track some of the social tokens. So again, like you can see these markets exist today. Now the value is fungible. Yeah, a bit more time. So yeah, when I really dive into what we see as layer two or social finance, this is kind of where social meets DeFi. So this is your, if you've covered everything in the previous one, you have like a base layer, and now you can build all of these primitives, the DeFi protocols on top of that base layer of social money. So this is where things get really interesting. Before I dive in here, I do want to emphasize that not all social money even has a market or is remotely traded. Everything on layer one, if you follow through, then it's already valuable. You don't need layer two. It's also right for some communities, and for some communities, it's not. Just to give an example on Roll, it kind of follows the Pareto distribution. So about 80% of the communities of the social money that we have issued on Roll actually have no formal market. It's only about 20% that do. Those do get talked about more. It's a nicer news story. Get more data. You have pretty graphs. But end of the day, it's all about who derives value from that, and you can derive all of that value just from layer one without the layer two stuff. Yeah, with that caveat, just jumping in then, the first primitive, that's the exchange. So this depends on the standard, something that I briefly alluded to in the creation part earlier. If you're building ERC20s, you can plug right into AMMs. That includes your Uniswap Balancer, SushiSwap, any other new flavor of the month as well. And marketplaces, that's your OpenSea, Rarible, etc. for NFTs. So again, like if you're building like an NFT or a gaming platform or an artist, for example, minting your art, you don't need to build what do I do about secondary marketplaces? Do I have to create a bidding system? Like you don't have to think about all that. It's all taken care of for you within this interoperable Ethereum ecosystem. Same with social money. Like we don't want to invent a bonding curve. We don't want to do how do you get a price discovery without an oracle. Like all of that's already taken care of, and we just rely on Uniswap mostly. And yeah, the other kind of thing is how you think about these things. So we think about market cap for social money, but we generally think about individual high sales for NFTs or like cumulative sales. So just a small distinction, but something that becomes important once you're analyzing the markets in more detail. For social money, especially, you can trade being part of one community for another. So once you have, let's say like 10 different groups that you're a part of, and you don't agree with what one group is doing, it's very easy to, let's say, like, sell your stake in that community and kind of double down on your stake in another community. So that kind of exchange is really valuable for people to have that option to exit. Here's a source from dap.com, again, just to give an example of the exchange volume. So they've tracked like the 30 social apps. They include non-Ethereum apps as well. So just as a high level. So they have about like $3.5 million worth of trading volumes. Again, like I said, like much smaller compared to some of the larger crypto markets, but not small enough to ignore anymore. So we're kind of right at that sweet spot of breaking out. So curation and access, it's one section I would like to spend a bit of time on. This is something that's emerged over the last few months that we have seen and kind of seen like a real strong demand. This also happens to be a very Web 2 first primitive, as opposed to most of the other primitives, which are kind of coming more from Web 3 and Ethereum. Curation and access, I'm kind of clubbing them in the same category, but the idea is, so think of curation first, right? Think about, so the first issuer on Roll, for example, was Laurel, and she's an Instagram beauty and ASMR influencer. So she does makeup videos. She does ASMR videos. If you guys are familiar with that, it's a genre where you make some sounds that give you a tingling sensation in your spine. If you're amenable to that specific response. And it becomes increasingly hard for them when you're on a platform like Instagram. So Laurel, for example, has about 225,000 followers on Instagram. She has no idea who they are or how to differentiate them. So all of them are pretty much exactly the same. It's almost like one username is indistinguishable from another. But that's not the ideal world you want to live in. So what you want to do as a creator is like you want to try to find your 100 or 1,000 true fans out of the tens of thousands of followers that you have. So that's kind of explains part of the rise of platforms like Patreon, for example. And for communities generally, it kind of follows the Price's Law, something that we have seen kind of become as well. So this is Price's Law kind of comes from the creative field, where about, if you look at a size of the creative outputs, about 50% of that is done by the square root of the size of number of people. So we kind of see that in a community size as well. If you have a community, again, this is obviously very average and roughly speaking, but in a community of 10,000 people, about 100 of them, that's like square root of 10,000, would probably provide half the value. But the thing is, with existing platforms, you don't know which 100 are those, and that's kind of a problem. So that's a curation problem. It's like, how do you surface fans and people who are more valuable to your community than others? And then the other thing is access on the flip side, which is if you are so let's continue with the example of creator-based communities opposed to like Reddit-style communities. So if you're still a creator-based communities and you do have a large following, you won't be able to, for example, hop on a Discord channel with everyone and answer all their questions. It's just too much coming at you. So this idea of exclusive groups and access becomes super interesting, and something we have seen many people experiment and find success with. So the idea of staking social money, kind of staking being one of the primitives that we talked about, instead of exchange, but exchange is as valid as anything else. Or it can be NFTs as well. So some of the models can just be, hey, if you do X, Y, and Z for the community, then you hold this NFT, and as long as you hold that NFT, you have access to this group. So something like that. Now we've seen that kind of small guilds emerge in games already. So if you look at Axie Infinity, for example, there's a guild for the holders of Genesis land, which is one of the rarest types of lands in the game. So kind of this similar idea there with social money as well, but kind of more extended towards Web 2 audiences. Yeah, so as curation and access, it's an interesting Web 2 primitive that we are kind of seeing that merge with the Web 3 world. So pretty excited to see some very early experiments kind of taking on in this space as well. And again, Curation and Access are already here. So here are two example communities. Like one is Whale. He's probably the largest NFT art collector in the world. And so you can see those little lock arrows on Discord. All that means is those groups are not accessible to everyone. You actually need to hold a certain amount of Whale to have access to that communities. On the right here, that's a Telegram group. This is Karma DAO. You need to hold a certain amount of karma to enter the group, and then you can kind of connect with all sorts of interesting and fun people once you're part of the group. So again, like these are already here. This is not theoretical anymore. As much as I would love to go into lending, borrowing, and derivatives, the reality is the markets are small. So I think it's still very early days. Kind of going back to the size of the market from Masari here, it's about 150, so 150, $200 million kind of being the total market size. I think it's a bit small for the emergence of regular lending, borrowing, and derivatives. But that being said, I think this is where DeFi and the merger of DeFi and social becomes super interesting with social finance. I'm going to guess we are probably 3 to 6 months away from seeing some proper products around this. But yeah, it's still early for derivatives. But some early experiments again going on, and really excited to see how that shapes up. Yeah, that's kind of high level what I have. For me, would love to get any thoughts from you guys or any questions, anything specific that might have appealed to you here that we can dive deep into.
All right, so I can start with a question actually. So regarding social money, I know you mentioned like you guys also target a lot of Web 2 projects, but for Web 3 there are governance tokens, and a lot of it does sound like very similar to social money in the sense that it's given to the community and it helps guide the direction for protocol growth and economic development over time. So like, do you see this like competing with governance tokens in the future, or do you think both can coexist?
Yeah, so it's like both can definitely coexist. If you look at governance tokens in the space today, like we borrow from those. But if you think about how many projects or protocols there are in the world, like all over, maybe hundreds of thousands, perhaps a million, of everything, all the companies and products and protocols that exist. But if you look at communities, that's a near infinite amount of them. So one of the things that social money is very interested in is like we learn from, or again, like same thing with communities generally, is you learn from those early experiments. So take DAO governance, for example. Someone like Wi-Fi, for example, is like really pushing the envelope on that. Now, but what we can do is we can learn from that. But for every one Wi-Fi, there are like 10,000 Substack writers. So that's who social money is really for.
Okay, got it. So it's for the subset of people, not for like the protocols exactly, but it's for the people.
Yeah, so it's there's yeah, but I mean that's a really good question, right? It's like ultimately it's where you draw the line of categorization. Generally, that's where we draw the line of categorization. But you're absolutely right. Like there's a world in which those two might merge. I'm not sure.
Okay, really interesting. So regarding social money, so I believe in learnings from like a lot of different spaces and different projects. For governance, I know in general, engagement and participation is very hard. So as someone who runs a lot of communities and does social money, what have you seen from different communities to actually help drive engagement? And which ones have you seen actually be successful at it?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So we have about like 270 communities on Roll. So we have seen that whole spectrum of people just spectacularly failing to kind of people being very successful. This is not a very feel-goody answer, but the voter apathy is very real. It's very hard even for your engaged community to like vote on a proposal. So in many cases, actually, it makes sense for them, again, if it's centered around one creator, for example, for them to make a centralized decision point and say, hey, this is what we're going to do because I said so. But again, like on the other end of the spectrum, some of the things that we have seen work is we've actually seen people build Discord bots where your reaction to a voting proposal is simply like a thumbs up and thumbs down. And at the end of the voting period, you automatically get social money rewarded if you have voted. So that's like a very easy to use, very simple, extremely low barrier to entry, because all you need to do is read like a little message on Discord and react with an emoji. And now you get some money. That's great. So we've seen some models like that become successful. But again, that becomes a bit platform specific. So your community has to live on Discord for that to work, for example.
So if something like that does work, does occur, how do any of these communities actually showcase their treasury in terms of how they manage? So like, let's say like XYZ token, like mints 1,000 tokens, and they distribute a certain amount to their community, not all of it. But then there's a certain amount left that they manage that they can use to drive participation from their community by, like, say, giving tokens when someone votes up or down.
Right.
So do people actually have access to see, like, what is being done, how that treasury is being managed? Like, what is being paid
totally.
to employees, what is being paid to, like, whatever? Because it's kind of an interesting, like, experiment, like a use case that, well, not use case, but interesting, like, experiment where people can experiment with treasury management for communities.
Yeah, so we've seen some very early models. So Brian Flynn, for example, with his Jam token, has kind of completely locked up all of the Jam into a DAO contract, and if he has to get paid to write, then the DAO actually has to vote yes. Otherwise, he does not get paid for his
Yes, I have
newsletter,
a lot
even
of
though like
friends.
so like I said, we're seeing those early experiments already in the space. In terms of data transparency, again, like luckily most of that's on the blockchain, so that's already taken care of. But one thing that really helps, which we made an early decision on that at Roll, and in hindsight, that was the right one, which is to standardize the economic parameters and include vesting as mandatory. So no one can issue on Roll without vesting for about 3 years. What that really does is, like, most of that value of those tokens is not even locked up in the DAO of today, but it's locked up in the DAO that will exist 3 years from now. And that's very interesting because it gives people that space to experiment in today, and then kind of take that community to success again in the future. So most of the value, again, like the capture of the community, happens in the future, so that when you're making decisions, it's not short term focused.
So for this lockup, I find it really interesting because it's very similar to how it works in, like, traditional tech for startups. Do you think it limits, like, liquidity early on, though?
So we do release 20% initially at issuance. So generally what we have seen is that amount has been enough so far. But the honest truth is, like, I'm not sure if that will always hold true irrespective of the use case. But we have generally seen 20%, let's say like a 3 to 5% of that distributed to your existing community, to the early community, like people now kind of doing something valuable, setting things up for you. And like a 5 to 10% kind of just sitting in the treasury, and another 5 to 10% in an exchange for liquidity providing. That kind of model has worked pretty well for many smaller communities.
Very cool. So are there any, like, weird or super cool, like, projects that have used Roll that you think people should check out?
I actually have some examples here. I think all of those are super cool. So our first issuer was Laurel. She's completely new to Web3, has never held Bitcoin on Ether. So her community is super interesting. Kind of more NFT artists. We have about 70 or 80 of them. I think all of them are interesting. But if there's one thing, you should probably check out Whale as well. Kind of one of probably the largest NFT art collector out there today.
Very cool. Awesome. Do you have any closing thoughts?
No, I think you guys can always reach me on Twitter. My DMs are always open. If anyone has any ideas or want to chat about anything, I'm always around.
Awesome. Thanks, Sid. This was a really great talk. We're going to transition to our next session now.
Thank you.